Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Haunted Tales. Tonight, we're venturing into some of the most chilling encounters ever reported inside cemetery grounds. 10 true stories that prove the dead don't always rest quietly. These aren't just ghost stories whispered around campfires. They come from night shift workers, grieving families, police officers, and security guards. Ordinary people who stumbled into extraordinary moments of terror among the headstones. Each account has been traced back to real testimonies, police logs, eyewitness reports, and first-hand confessions from those who still struggle to talk about what they saw. What makes these stories even more unsettling is how many of them share the same eerie patterns, as if something beyond coincidence is unfolding in cemeteries across the world. If this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe to Haunted Tales and hit the notification bell. We bring you closer to the shadows every night with raw, authentic horror you won't hear anywhere else. So lock your doors, dim the lights, and walk with me through the rusted gates of these haunted burial grounds. Because once you hear these stories, you might begin to notice something strange on your next visit to a cemetery. Or worse, you might realize it's already been following you home. The night was heavy with silence when a pair of Cook County police officers pulled their cruiser to the side of a dirt trail off 143rd Street in Midlothian, Illinois. It was the late 1970s, and though the forest preserves were a common patrol route, neither officer liked stopping here. The narrow road twisted through thick trees, their branches arching overhead like skeletal arms, and at the end sat a place many officers avoided at all costs: Bachelor's Grove Cemetery. By daylight, it was little more than an overgrown, half-forgotten graveyard. A rusted gate, leaning headstones, some broken, some missing entirely. But by night, it was something else. A black hollow in the woods, a place of unfinished business. For over a century, stories had swirled around this cemetery. It dated back to the early 1800s when German immigrants first buried their loved ones here. But as the decades passed, the little burial ground fell into neglect. During Prohibition, it became a dumping ground for mobsters. Rumors spread of bodies hidden in shallow graves. Gangland executions carried out under the cover of the oaks. And later, in the 1960s and 70s, Bachelor's Grove became infamous for something darker still: satanic rituals. Residents told of finding headless chickens, melted candles, and even freshly dug pits as if someone or something had been called from the earth. But the police officers that night weren't there for folklore. They were responding to yet another call. Strange lights in the cemetery, people screaming, a possible fight in the woods. They stepped from the cruiser, flashlights cutting through the fog, rolling low across the ground. Their boots crunched the gravel. The woods seemed to close around them, silent but expectant. That's when they saw it. At the edge of the cemetery clearing stood a house. It was small, white, and old-fashioned, the kind of farmhouse that might have been built in the 1800s. Its windows glowed faintly with a pale yellow light, like kerosene lamps burning within. One officer raised his flashlight, signaling to the other. Had someone built a shack out here? Squatters, maybe? But as they stepped closer, the farmhouse seemed to shift. The walls shimmered as though made of smoke. The front porch wavered, and then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The officers froze. They'd both seen it. Later, each swore in their reports that a structure had been standing there, clear as day, and had simply dissolved into the night air. The Phantom Farmhouse, as it came to be known, would be reported dozens more times by hikers, paranormal investigators, and curious locals. No trace of any foundation has ever been found, but the farmhouse is only one of Bachelor's Grove's many horrors. The most famous apparition tied to the cemetery is known as the White Lady, or sometimes the Madonna of Bachelor's Grove. She has been described for decades as a pale woman, dressed in flowing white, carrying an infant in her arms. Her face is mournful, eyes hollow with eternal grief. Witnesses often spot her drifting silently between the headstones, or standing over a particular grave before vanishing into the darkness. In 1991, a paranormal research team visited the cemetery armed with cameras. One of those photographs, which would later appear in Time magazine, showed an unmistakable figure seated on a broken tombstone. A woman in white, transparent but detailed, the folds of her gown clear as day. The researchers insisted no one had been visible at the time the photo was taken. Skeptics have tried to debunk it, but to this day, it remains one of the most chilling and convincing pieces of evidence ever captured in a haunted cemetery. Local lore claims the White Lady was a grieving mother buried without her child. Others say she was a victim of gang violence during the Prohibition era, but whoever she was, her spirit has never left Bachelor's Grove. In 1973, another Cook County officer responded to reports of trespassers in the woods near the cemetery. As he parked along the roadside, his headlights caught movement. A horse and plow, the kind used a century earlier, was slowly crossing the road. The officer blinked in disbelief. The spectral figure of a man walked behind the plow, his head bent in silence. A moment later, the entire scene faded into the forest as if swallowed by fog. When the officer asked about it later, locals told him of an old farmer who drowned with his horse in a nearby pond. Some believe the land itself replayed his death over and over, for those unlucky enough to witness it. Bachelor's Grove became a notorious hangout for teenagers in the 1980s and 90s. But many of those who went in for a thrill came out pale, shaken, unwilling to ever return. One group of friends recalled sitting in a circle on a warm summer night, drinking and telling ghost stories among the tilted gravestones. The air was thick with mosquitoes and the smell of damp earth. Around midnight, one of the boys noticed something moving in the brush. At first, he thought it was another group sneaking up on them. But when he shined his flashlight toward the sound, the beam revealed a figure crouching just beyond the tree line. It was a man, or at least something shaped like one. His skin was gray, mottled like stone. His eyes glowed faintly, catching the light like an animal's. When the flashlight hit him fully, the figure straightened, towering over 6 feet, and stepped forward without a sound. The group bolted. They didn't stop until they reached their cars. Later, when one of the boys dared to look back, the figure was gone. But he swore he could still feel its gaze burning into his spine. Drivers passing by Bachelor's Grove on the adjoining road have reported another phenomenon: phantom cars. In multiple instances, motorists described a black vehicle suddenly appearing in their rearview mirror, its headlights glaring and its grille nearly pressed against their bumper. Terrified, they would speed up, only for the car to vanish instantly into thin air. One woman, interviewed in a 2002 news segment, recalled how she nearly swerved off the road trying to escape a phantom black sedan. When she regained control and looked again, the road behind her was empty. Even today, Bachelor's Grove remains one of the most studied and feared cemeteries in America. Paranormal investigators flock to it, drawn by decades of consistent reports. Shadowy figures darting between graves, disembodied voices caught on recorders, glowing orbs that hover in the trees. Police still receive calls from locals who swear they see lights moving in the cemetery late at night, even when the grounds are deserted. Visitors often describe a sense of being watched the moment they step inside the gates. Some leave with scratches on their arms or backs. Others say their equipment malfunctions, batteries draining in seconds. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Bachelor's Grove is the silence. Those who have walked its narrow paths at night claim the world itself seems to stop. Crickets, owls, the wind in the trees, all fall away until nothing remains but your own breath, your own heartbeat, and the cold certainty that you are not alone. Bachelor's Grove is more than just a forgotten cemetery. It is a place where the past bleeds into the present, where grief and violence have left scars that time cannot heal. Whether it is the grieving White Lady, the phantom farmhouse, or the restless spirits of mob victims, one thing is certain: this cemetery remembers. And if you visit on the wrong night, it may remember you too. The road was long, flat, and empty when Jerry Pallas left the Willowbrook Ballroom on Archer Avenue just outside of Chicago. It was the mid-1930s and Jerry, a young man in his 20s, had spent the night dancing under the colored lights, drinking Coca-Cola, and tapping his polished shoes against the polished floorboards. He'd gone to the ballroom hoping for nothing more than music and fun, but that night would stay with him for the rest of his life, because that was the night he met Mary. She was standing near the edge of the dance floor, quiet, graceful, wearing a pale dress that caught the light like frost. There was something about her that drew him in, not just her beauty, but the strange sadness in her eyes. He asked her to dance, and she nodded. For hours they moved across the floor, partners lost in rhythm. But whenever Jerry asked her questions, where she lived, who she had come with, her answers were vague, quiet, almost evasive. When the night came to an end and the orchestra packed away their instruments, Jerry insisted on driving her home. She agreed, slipping into the passenger seat of his car. As they rolled down Archer Avenue, the two spoke little. She only asked him to keep driving north, her pale hands folded neatly in her lap. At one point, Jerry glanced at her in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. She seemed colder than before, her skin almost luminous. Then, as they reached the gates of Resurrection Cemetery, she turned to him. "This is where I need to stop." Before Jerry could answer, before he could even press the brakes, the girl vanished. One moment she was there. The next, the seat beside him was empty. The door had never opened. The air was heavy with the sudden absence, and Jerry's breath caught in his throat. His car rolled to a stop before the cemetery gates, the wrought iron bars glistening with frost. Behind them, the shadows of monuments and gravestones stood in silent rows, the night air pressing in around him. Jerry later returned with friends, determined to prove he hadn't imagined it. Others came too, and slowly the legend of Resurrection Mary was born. For nearly a century now, drivers along Archer Avenue have reported encounters with the same spectral figure. Always a young woman, always wearing white, sometimes asking for a ride, sometimes simply walking along the roadside with a faraway expression. Taxi drivers, truckers, even entire busloads of passengers have sworn to seeing her. Some picked her up only to watch her vanish before their eyes. Others claimed she disappeared when they passed the gates of Resurrection Cemetery. As if drawn back by an unseen hand, the cemetery itself is vast, more than 540 acres of graves stretching back to the 1800s. It is the resting place of over 150,000 souls, their stories buried beneath stone and soil. But Mary's story seems to have refused burial. She is believed to be a young woman who died tragically in the 1930s after leaving the ballroom one night. Some say a hit and run on Archer Avenue, others say a violent accident. Records are unclear, names vary, but the essence of the story never changes. A young life cut short, forever tied to the road she never made it home from. In the 1970s, one of the most chilling reports came from a driver who claimed he nearly struck a young woman outside the cemetery gates. He swerved violently, his tires screaming across the pavement, but when he leapt from the car, there was no one there. Shaken, he approached the gates to steady himself and saw something that turned his stomach cold. Two iron bars of the cemetery's gate were bent wide apart, as though pried by massive force. Embedded in the metal, clear as day, were the impressions of hands. Human hands, thin fingers, palms pressed deep into the iron as if someone had grabbed the gate in desperation. The marks are still visible today. Another night in 1989, a cab driver pulled into Chet's Melody Lounge, a bar near the cemetery, in a panic. He swore to patrons that a young blonde woman in a pale dress had hailed him on Archer Avenue. She asked to be taken to the cemetery. He'd driven her there, but halfway through the ride, she simply disappeared from the back seat. His words shook as he told them. She was there. She was talking to me, and then she wasn't. Police dispatchers, too, have received calls. Motorists reporting a woman wandering Archer Avenue in freezing temperatures, sometimes barefoot, sometimes stumbling in distress. Squads have been sent out, lights flashing through the night, but no trace of her was ever found. Truckers, more than any, speak of her. Long-haul drivers alone on the road at 3 a.m., their headlights sweeping across the asphalt, catch sight of her walking steadily along the roadside. She does not look their way. She does not flag them down. She only walks, her white dress trailing like mist, her figure pale against the black trees. And as they approach, she dissolves, leaving the cab driver's chest heaving, his grip white-knuckled on the wheel. Resurrection Cemetery itself is a strange place at night. Locals speak of wandering lights that weave among the gravestones, like lanterns carried by invisible hands. Some visitors report sudden drops in temperature, their breath fogging even in summer. Others say the air smells faintly of roses, an odd sweetness that vanishes as quickly as it comes. And sometimes, in the dead stillness of the grounds, footsteps are heard, soft, padded, as though someone is walking just behind you, always a step too late for you to catch. There are countless theories about Mary. Some say she is simply a classic case of the vanishing hitchhiker, a folktale repeated across cultures. But skeptics struggle to explain the physical evidence, the bent cemetery bars, the detailed descriptions that match across decades, the dozens of cab drivers and police officers with nothing to gain from their testimonies. What is perhaps most unsettling is her persistence. Unlike other urban legends that fade with time, Resurrection Mary endures. From the 1930s to the present day, her figure still haunts Archer Avenue. Reports come less frequently now, but they come nonetheless. Men driving alone in the small hours, couples returning from late dinners, drivers unfamiliar with the road who later learn they are not the first to see a pale young woman vanish into the cemetery gates. The road itself feels different near Resurrection Cemetery. Travelers often describe it as heavy, like the air thickens and the forest leans closer. Some say the silence is what unsettles them most. No insects, no wind, only the rhythmic hum of tires on pavement and the creeping dread that someone, unseen, rides with you. Those who have felt it never forget. One man, interviewed in the 1990s, said he saw her walking along the roadside late one snowy night. She looked so real, so tangible, that he pulled over and called out, worried for her safety. She turned her head toward him, just slightly, and her face caught the glow of his headlights. It was pale, too pale. Her eyes were lifeless, fixed on some distant point he could not see. He called again, louder, but she only turned away and walked on. He drove off trembling, refusing to look in the rear. The small town of Stull, Kansas doesn't appear on most maps. It lies tucked away in Douglas County, little more than farmland, a scattering of homes, and one quiet road that winds toward a hilltop cemetery. By day, it looks ordinary, a small burial ground surrounded by broken fence posts and gnarled trees. But when night falls, the name Stull carries weight, whispers, warnings. Because for decades, locals have called this place something far darker. A gateway, a door, a wound in the earth where the living and the dead are separated only by the thinnest of veils. It is said that if you stand in Stull Cemetery on the right night, you will not stand alone. The legends go back more than a century. In the late 1800s, a small stone church was built near the center of the cemetery. Its roof eventually collapsed, leaving only jagged walls and a hollow interior where weeds grew between the cracks. But locals whispered that the church was no ordinary ruin. Some claimed it was once used for dark rituals, its altar a place of sacrifice. Others said it was cursed ground, a place where the devil himself appeared twice a year, once on the spring equinox, and once on Halloween. For years, the building was left untouched. But no one dared linger there after dark. Even farmers avoided the cemetery road at night, hitching their horses to take longer routes instead. Children who wandered too close returned pale, whispering about voices in the air, shadows that did not belong. By the mid-20th century, stories spread beyond the town. Travelers from Lawrence and Topeka began driving out to Stull at night, daring one another to step inside the ruins of the old church. Many returned shaken. They spoke of sudden gusts of wind when the night had been still, of strange laughter echoing through the stones. A few swore that when they stood within the crumbling walls, no sound reached them from outside. It was as though the air itself had been swallowed. One student from the University of Kansas recalled visiting with friends on Halloween night in 1978. They parked at the bottom of the hill and made their way up in silence, their flashlights bouncing across broken headstones. The church stood in the distance, its silhouette jagged against the stars. As they drew near, one of the boys laughed, mocking the stories. He stepped boldly inside, spreading his arms as though to embrace the night, and then he froze. The others followed cautiously, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the dark. What they saw made their blood run cold. Inside the ruined church was a staircase, narrow, stone, leading downward into the earth. They had heard rumors, yes, that beneath Stoll Cemetery there was a hidden pit, a direct passage to hell itself. And now here it was before them, but the moment they saw it, the air changed. The ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. A sound, low and guttural, rose from the darkness below. The boy who had mocked the story screamed and stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the others. They bolted from the church, their hearts pounding, not daring to look back until they were safe in the car. Later, when they told the story to friends, they insisted the staircase had been there, carved deep into the ground. But when others came to look for it, nothing was found. Just dirt, just stone, no stairs. The legend of the gateway spread like wildfire. Journalists picked it up. Paranormal investigators flocked to the site. Some claimed to see the devil himself appear at the cemetery, towering and horned, while others spoke of hooded figures gathering around the church ruins in the dead of night. The more attention it drew, the more Stoll's reputation grew. In the early 1990s, the remaining walls of the church were torn down. Officially, it was for safety reasons, to stop thrill seekers from getting injured. But locals whispered it was something else, that the church had grown too dangerous, too powerful, attracting attention from forces best left undisturbed. Even without the building, the stories continued. Police officers patrolling the area often spoke of strange calls. One deputy claimed that late one October night, his radio filled with static as he passed the cemetery. The lights in his cruiser flickered. And then, in the middle of the empty road, a figure appeared. A man, tall and cloaked, standing utterly still. The officer slammed the brakes, heart pounding, but in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. When he stepped from the car to investigate, the air smelled of sulfur, acrid, choking, lingering long after the figure had vanished. Another account comes from a group of teenagers who dared each other to spend a night near the cemetery in 1999. They sat huddled on blankets, trying to laugh away their nerves. Around midnight, one of them noticed a shadow moving between the trees. Then another. Soon shapes surrounded them on all sides. Not clear figures, but shifting masses darker than the night itself. They heard whispers, at first faint, then louder, until it was as though dozens of voices spoke at once, none in a language they understood. Terrified, they fled, but one boy tripped and fell behind. When the others reached the car and turned back, they saw him standing frozen near the cemetery fence, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a silent scream. They dragged him back, and though he survived, he never spoke of what he saw. Even clergy have been unnerved by Stoll. In the early 2000s, a local pastor was asked about the cemetery during a televised interview. His face tightened. He refused to speak directly, only saying that some places are touched by darkness, and that faith itself can falter there. When pressed, he changed the subject entirely. Some say the devil's appearances at Stoll are tied to a tragedy long buried. One story tells of a child born of unspeakable union, hidden in the town and buried in secret. Another speaks of an early settler who made a pact, exchanging souls for prosperity. The truth is impossible to verify. The records are sparse, the rumors tangled. But in the stillness of the cemetery at night, with the wind cutting through the trees and the gravestones leaning like crooked teeth, the weight of something unseen is undeniable. Visitors still report it. A sudden silence, a sense of being watched, the feeling that if you stand too long among the graves, something will notice you, something will remember you. One man, interviewed in 2013, said he stopped at the cemetery out of curiosity. He stayed only 5 minutes, walking quietly among the stones. But when he returned to his truck, the passenger side door was open. Inside lay a single black feather. Today, the cemetery is guarded, fenced off to deter trespassers. Yet people still come. They press their faces against the bars. They peer through the trees, hoping for a glimpse. Some say if you linger long enough on the equinox or Halloween, you will see what so many before you have sworn to see, the ground open. The back roads of eastern Connecticut are not the kind of roads one takes by accident. They wind through old farmland and patches of forest that seem too thick for the modern world, their branches rising over the asphalt in jagged shapes that blot out the moonlight. At night they close in like the ribs of some enormous beast, caging the traveler inside. If you follow these roads long enough, past the farmhouses that lean with age and the small towns that die to silence after dark, you eventually reach a clearing. There, set back behind rusted iron gates and crooked headstones, lies Union Cemetery, a place that has earned its reputation as one of the most haunted graveyards in America. By day, Union looks like a relic of colonial New England. Its oldest graves date back to the 1700s, many so weathered their names have been lost to time. The land itself is uneven, as though the earth resists the bodies beneath it. Some graves sink inward, others tilt sideways, their inscriptions eroded into scars by centuries of rain and frost. Tourists who wander here in the daylight describe the cemetery as peaceful, even picturesque, with its stone walls and patches of soft grass. But when the sun falls behind the trees, Union transforms into something else entirely. The silence becomes oppressive. The shadows seem to stretch farther than they should. And it is in that silence locals say that she appears the White Lady. Her legend is as old as the graveyard itself, though her story is shrouded in uncertainty. Some say she was a mother who died in childbirth, condemned to wander eternally in search of the child torn from her. Others claim she was a woman murdered nearby, her body never given a proper burial, her spirit chained to the cemetery. Still others whisper that she is not one woman at all, but a collection of grief, sorrow, and death, an embodiment of the tragedies that seep into the ground of Union Cemetery. Whatever the truth, her presence is not folklore alone. Witnesses across decades, ordinary motorists, police officers, and even renowned paranormal investigators have seen her. They describe the same details. A woman in a flowing white gown, translucent, gliding silently between the graves, her face hidden, her form glowing faintly in the dark. One of the most chilling accounts came from a local police officer. It was a cold autumn night, the kind where the mist lingers low to the ground and the air smells of damp earth. He was patrolling the back roads near Route 59, his headlights carving narrow tunnels of light through the fog. As his cruiser rolled past Union Cemetery, something caught his eye. At first it looked like a figure standing in the road, a woman, pale and thin, her gown fluttering though the night was still. He slammed the brakes, tires screeching, but not before he felt the impact. The car jolted. He swore he had hit her. Heart pounding, he threw the gear into park and leapt out, flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The road was empty. No body. No blood. The only sound was his own breathing, harsh in the quiet. He circled the car, searching for damage, but the grille was clean, unmarked. That's when he saw her again, standing just inside the cemetery gate, her gown glowing faintly against the darkness, her face a pale blur. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply stared, hollow and unblinking. And then, as he raised the beam of his light, she drifted backwards, dissolving into the mist like smoke into air. The officer returned to his cruiser, shaken, his hands trembling too badly to hold the radio. In the days that followed, he refused to patrol that stretch of road again. Stories like his are not rare. Over the years, countless motorists have reported striking a woman in white near Union Cemetery. Each time, no body is ever found. The Warrens' famed paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine made Union one of their most documented cases. Lorraine herself, known for her ability to perceive spirits, swore she saw the White Lady with her own eyes. She described her as a spectral figure, almost glowing, drifting among the headstones, her gown flowing behind her as though carried by a breeze that no one else could feel. Lorraine warned that the White Lady was not a harmless apparition. She believed the spirit was bound to the cemetery by powerful grief, a sorrow so deep it clings to the mortal world, unable to let go. One story the Warrens recorded involved a man driving late along Route 59, headlights cutting through thick fog. His passenger sat silently beside him when, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. A woman, glowing white, arms raised as though to shield herself from the oncoming car. He swerved violently, the tires screaming as the car spun into the shoulder. For a moment, silence pressed down on them both, broken only by the hiss of the cooling engine. Then his passenger whispered, voice trembling, "She's not gone." He turned, and there she was. Inches from the glass, her face pressed to the passenger side window, her eyes black voids, her lips moving silently in words they could not hear. The glass fogged with her breath, though the night air was cold. And then in an instant she was gone. They drove on in silence, the smell of damp roses clinging to the car for miles. Union Cemetery itself seems to breathe with her presence. Visitors speak of footsteps pacing behind them on gravel paths, though no one is there. Others describe a sudden drop in temperature, as though a cold hand has brushed across their skin. Some hear whispers carried on the wind, voices too faint to understand. Paranormal investigators who set up cameras and recorders often capture strange anomalies, flickers of red light darting between trees, shadows stretching unnaturally across the ground, or faint cries recorded on tape when no one else was near. Even skeptics, those who come expecting nothing, leave with stories they cannot explain. What unsettles locals most is the unpredictability of her appearances. She does not come only to believers or thrill seekers. She comes to police officers, to truckers, to travelers just passing through. Sometimes she stands silently among the graves, her gown drifting as if underwater. Sometimes she appears in the road, forcing drivers to swerve or slam their brakes. And sometimes she follows. Witnesses claim to see her face in their mirrors, lingering just long enough to freeze the blood before she vanishes again. Union's history only deepens the fear. The ground here holds centuries of the dead, many buried hastily in unmarked graves. The stones lean at odd angles, their inscriptions worn into illegibility. Locals whisper of shadows that linger where no light should fall, of figures moving behind the iron fence when no one is inside. Some say the earth itself rejects the peace of death, and that is why she cannot rest. Police continue to receive calls from motorists who believe they've struck a pedestrian near Union Cemetery. Each time, the scene is the same. No body, no blood, no evidence of impact. Yet the details never change. Always a woman in white, always appearing in the same stretch of road. Hollywood Forever Cemetery rests quietly in the middle of Los Angeles, a city that never truly sleeps. By day, it seems almost like a park, its palm-lined paths and lush green lawns offering a strange kind of beauty, even serenity for tourists who wander through the graves of icons. But once the sun drops behind the hills, the atmosphere changes. The air grows heavy and the silence becomes too sharp, as though the very earth is listening. To those who know the place intimately, the caretakers, the guards, the rare foolhardy visitor who has stayed too long, Hollywood Forever does not rest easy. This is no ordinary graveyard. The dead here do not sleep quietly. They stir, they linger, and sometimes they show themselves. It is a cemetery like no other, not only because of who is buried here, but because of the weight of their memories. Names carved into marble are names the world once cheered, names whose faces once lit up silver screens or whose voices filled radios. Valentino, Fairbanks, Garland, Tyrone Power, Dee Dee Ramone. Even the tragic Chris Cornell rests here, his grave still covered in offerings from grieving fans. The cemetery has become a shrine for fame, a sanctuary for memory, and some believe a stage upon which restless spirits continue their performances long after the curtains have fallen. The most famous spirit tied to this place is Rudolph Valentino, the silent film star whose death in 1926 at the age of just 31 plunged his admirers into near hysteria. Tens of thousands flooded the streets to mourn him. Women fainted, some even took their own lives, unable to imagine a world without their screen idol. His grave quickly became a place of pilgrimage. Each year, on the anniversary of his death, roses appear upon his crypt. The story that emerged almost immediately was of a veiled woman dressed head to toe in black, the mysterious lady in black, who would appear at dawn to leave flowers and then vanish as quietly as she came. For decades, no one could agree on who she was. Some claimed she was one of Valentino's mistresses, others a grieving fan, others a publicity stunt. But too many witnesses swore the lady in black had no discernible face beneath the veil, only the hollow suggestion of features. When approached, she disappeared like smoke. Guards have admitted, in whispers, to encountering her themselves, and not only on anniversaries. One man, years ago, swore he found her standing motionless before the crypt late one night after he'd locked the gates. Her bouquet lay at her feet, fresh as though just cut. Yet when he called out to her, she turned slowly, raised a gloved hand as if to beckon him, and then dissolved into the night air, leaving only the roses behind. But Valentino is far from the only presence here. The caretakers who work late shifts speak of phantom music drifting from the chapel after midnight. It is always faint, as though carried from another time, but unmistakable. A piano playing soft, lilting notes, sometimes accompanied by the faintest hum of a female voice. When the chapel doors are unlocked, the music stops. The keys remain untouched, the room empty. Yet the perfume of roses or lilacs often lingers, as though someone had just stepped away. Paranormal researchers speculate it may be connected to one of the actresses interred here, perhaps one who played piano at glamorous parties in the Roaring '20s. Others whisper it could be Judy Garland herself, her crypt one of the cemetery's most visited sites. Visitors swear they have felt her presence, warm and maternal, sometimes accompanied by laughter echoing faintly through the mausoleum corridors. The security guards, however, tell darker stories. One former guard, a man who had walked the grounds for nearly 15 years, described a shift that left him shaken enough to quit the very next day. It was well past 2 a.m, the city hushed beyond the gates, when he heard footsteps pacing behind him along the central path. He assumed it was a trespasser and called out, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog that had rolled across the cemetery like a shroud. The footsteps paused. He scanned the path, empty. Then they started again, quicker this time, almost running. He spun in every direction but saw nothing. By the time he reached the reflecting pool, he was nearly sprinting himself. As he tried to unlock the service gate, he dropped his keys. When he bent to retrieve them, he froze. A shadow loomed across the gravel, tall and broad-shouldered, standing directly behind him. His heart slammed in his chest. He turned and there was nothing. The gate rattled in his trembling grip as he shoved it open and fled. He swore he never returned for another shift. Even visitors by day have stories to tell. A photographer, fascinated by the ornate mausoleums and towering obelisks, once came to capture the cemetery's beauty near sunset. As he stood by the lake, he noticed ripples spreading across the water, though there was no breeze. Lifting his camera, he caught sight of a man leaning against a tree. A striking man, hair slicked back, suit pressed, posture confident. For a moment, the figure seemed as solid as anyone else. The photographer raised his lens, snapped the picture, and looked up to adjust the angle. But the man was gone. Later, when the photos were developed, only the tree and lake remained. No man, no trace. Some stories are subtler, yet no less disturbing. Visitors have complained of hearing faint weeping near certain graves, but upon searching, they find only silence. Others have felt icy hands brush against their shoulders in broad daylight. A few have walked into mausoleums only to hear whispering voices circling them from the shadows, and more than one tourist has left suddenly, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, as though eyes followed them from every direction. But perhaps the most unsettling tales come from the mausoleums themselves. Guards have reported doors rattling violently in the dead of night, hinges shaking though no wind stirs. Some claim to hear knocking from within sealed crypts, as if the inhabitants were restless, desperate to be let out. A janitor once confessed that while mopping near one particular corridor, he heard laughter erupt from behind a locked door. It was not the laughter of the living. It was brittle, hollow, and echoed unnaturally through the stone. Terrified, he dropped his bucket and ran, refusing to ever return to that wing. Hollywood Forever is not like other cemeteries where the dead are silent. Here, fame itself seems to fuel something else, something that refuses to fade. Perhaps it is the desperation of stars who live their lives in the spotlight, unable to accept the quiet of death. Perhaps it is the grief of fans who poured so much longing into these icons that the very energy lingers in the soil. Or perhaps the land itself is cursed by the sheer volume of memory, tragedy, and worship it has absorbed. Whatever the cause, the effect is undeniable. The cemetery feels alive. To walk its grounds at night is to step into a dream both beautiful and terrifying. The palm trees sway in the moonlight. Shadows stretch unnaturally long across the marble, and the silence is so thick it seems to hum. Even the air feels different, charged with static, as if the line between this world and the next is paper thin. More than one person has claimed that the dead here are aware of those who wander among them, that they reach out, hungry not to be forgotten. Hollywood is built on illusion. The stars buried here may have been mortal, but their images endure, their voices echo on screens and in songs. Perhaps that is why they do not rest. In life they were adored, immortalized. In death they cling to that immortality, unwilling to fade into obscurity. And so the stories continue. Valentino's Lady in Black still appears, gliding silently between crypts. Judy Garland's laughter is said to linger like an echo in the wind. The phantom piano plays, keys pressed by unseen hands. Shadows stalk the paths. Doors rattle. Voices call. The cemetery may lock its gates at night, but nothing keeps the dead contained. For those who have walked Hollywood forever under moonlight, one truth becomes clear. This is not a place where silence reigns. It is a place where the past still breathes, where the departed whisper, and where every shadow might be a star refusing to dim. The performances have ended. The applause has long since faded. But here, among the marble and roses, the curtain has never truly fallen. La Noria lies deep in the Atacama Desert of Chile, one of the driest places on Earth, where the sun burns mercilessly by day and the cold bites sharply at night. What remains of the mining town is little more than ruins, crumbling adobe walls, rusting machinery half swallowed by sand, skeletal wooden beams that jut like broken ribs against the horizon. This place was once alive with the clamor of nitrate mining, the cries of workers, the rhythm of industry. But industry gave way to collapse, poverty, and death. Now the desert has reclaimed it. The silence here is absolute, save for the low whistle of the wind across the dunes. Yet within this silence, the cemetery of La Noria keeps its vigil. It is no ordinary cemetery. The graves lie open, coffins broken, bones exposed to the relentless sun. Skulls peer skyward, ribs and femurs protrude from the sand like forgotten relics. For decades, the locals have whispered, "The dead of La Noria do not stay still." From the moment you approach the graveyard, unease takes hold. The iron gate, warped and half off its hinges, seems almost a warning. Inside, the earth is uneven, the graves shallow, as if hastily dug. Some coffins have long since decayed, leaving the remains bare to the desert air. To an outsider, it may look like desecration, neglect, or the simple erosion of time. But the villagers who live in nearby towns insist otherwise. They say the graves were not opened by men, but by the hands of the dead themselves. They say the corpses climb from the earth after sunset, their bones rattling, their eyeless sockets glinting in the moonlight, wandering the sands in silence until dawn. Few are willing to speak of it openly, and fewer still would dare step foot inside after dark. There are old stories, passed down like curses. A traveler once camped by the ruins of La Noria, ignoring the warnings. He pitched his tent within sight of the cemetery and built a fire against the chill of night. As the flames flickered, he began to hear footsteps, not soft but heavy, crunching across gravel. At first he thought it might be animals, desert foxes or strays from some distant ranch. But the steps grew louder, multiplied. He swore he heard the crack of dry bones with every movement. When he leaned from his tent to look, his fire sputtering low, he saw them, figures, dozens of them, staggering across the sand. They did not walk like the living. They swayed, bent, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles. He froze as they drew nearer, their empty sockets reflecting the firelight. One reached out an arm, no flesh clinging to it, only bone. The man screamed, abandoned his camp, and ran into the desert night. Days later, he stumbled into a village half mad, his skin blistered by the sun, his voice nearly gone. He lived, but he never set foot in La Noria again. Even government workers, sent to document the ruins as historical heritage, have told uneasy stories. One man claimed that while photographing the cemetery at dusk, he heard whispering all around him. Spanish words muttered urgently, though no one else was present. He snapped picture after picture, desperate to convince himself it was imagination. Later, when the photos were developed, he found strange smudges in several frames, figures that looked like people standing between the graves, blurred as though they moved too quickly to be captured. Yet he swore no living soul was near him. He refused to return for a second expedition. The Atacama itself seems to conspire with the dead. At night, the desert is freezing. The air so dry it scrapes the lungs, the stars cutting bright and merciless in the sky. The silence is not peaceful but oppressive. In La Noria, this silence feels alive. Visitors report the sensation of being watched, of shadows shifting where none should be. A chill moves through the graves even when the night is still. Some speak of hearing the faint sound of weeping carried on the wind, others the low groan of voices rising together in some forgotten lament. The brave or the foolish who have entered the cemetery by moonlight say the bones do not rest where they lay. Skulls that once faced the heavens have turned in new directions. Coffins cracked open one night seem more broken by the next, and in the morning, footprints appear in the sand, human-shaped, yet scattered and disjointed, leading from grave to grave with no living culprit to account for them. One of the most chilling accounts comes from a group of thrill seekers, young men who decided to challenge the legend. They drove to La Noria under a full moon, armed with flashlights and bravado, determined to spend the night among the dead. At first, they laughed at the eerie sight of bones in the sand, mocking the stories. They sat near the graves, drinking, joking, daring each other to touch the skulls. Hours passed uneventfully until one noticed something strange. The sand had shifted near a nearby grave, the earth bulging upward. They froze, their laughter dying in their throats as a pale hand clawed its way free, fingers curled, skeletal, grasping at the night air. Another movement, another hand, pulling, straining, until the cracked lid of a coffin splintered further. Panic erupted. They fled in every direction, but one dropped his flashlight in the chaos. He claimed later that as he stooped to retrieve it, he saw not one but many figures rising from the earth, their heads lolling, their limbs jerking as though pulled by invisible strings. He swore they watched him run, their sockets fixed upon him, and that he heard their bones clattering in unison like a macabre applause. None of the group ever spoke publicly again of that night. What makes La Noria all the more terrifying is its authenticity. The open graves are real, not tales. Photographs exist, showing bleached bones resting under the merciless desert sun. Locals will not enter, not even in daylight. The cemetery has become something like a wound, a place where the natural order has been broken. Whether the spirits are restless because of violent deaths, the suffering of miners who toiled and perished in misery, or because of the desecration of their resting place, no one can say. Some blame ancient curses, others the cruelty of men who left their dead unprotected. But all agree, the energy is wrong, poisoned, eternal. Even skeptics who come expecting only folklore admit to feeling dread here. A documentary crew once interviewed a villager who refused to stand near the gate as the cameras rolled. She clutched a rosary, her eyes darting constantly to the cemetery behind her, and whispered that the dead of La Noria walk because they are lonely, because they were abandoned, because no prayers are spoken for them anymore. She warned the crew to leave before dark. They stayed. That night, their equipment malfunctioned, batteries draining inexplicably, audio recordings filled with static and faint voices. On review, one clip captured a single, chilling phrase whispered in Spanish, "Estamos aquí." We are here. The story of La Noria spreads not because of ghost hunters or legends exaggerated for tourists. Indeed, most Chileans prefer not to speak of it, but because the evidence cannot be ignored. The cemetery is there, the graves are open, the bones are exposed, and no one has dared to properly enter them again. It is as though the entire region respects or fears the restless dead too much to disturb them further. Those who have looked into the hollow sockets of La Noria's dead insist something gazes back. Not merely the emptiness of death, but a consciousness, ancient and patient, watching the living with mute accusation. Some believe the desert itself preserves them, trapping their spirits between worlds, unable to decay, unable to rest. And so they wander, not to harm, but to remind, to haunt, to ensure they are never forgotten. To walk through La Noria is to tread on sacred ground corrupted by time and neglect. Every crunch of sand beneath your boots feels like an intrusion. Every shadow, every whisper of wind carries menace. You cannot help but glance over your shoulder, half expecting to see figures rising silently from the earth, following your every step. La Noria is more than a ghost story. It is a scar, a place where the veil between life and death has torn open, where the dead themselves seem unwilling or unable. Highgate Cemetery sits in the heart of London, its sprawling grounds overrun by ivy, brambles, and towering trees that cast the monuments into perpetual shadow. Built in the Victorian era, it was intended as a place of dignity, a garden for the dead where London's wealthy could rest eternally in Gothic splendor. Over time, however, neglect overtook its beauty. By the mid-20th century, Highgate had become a wilderness of toppled gravestones, vine-choked angels, and mausoleums sinking into the earth. To walk there at dusk is to wander through a nightmare of stone and shadow, where the air is damp and heavy with moss, and every pathway seems to lead deeper into silence. For centuries, whispers of spirits have surrounded Highgate. But in the 1970s, something darker emerged, something that would spark a frenzy across England and forever tie Highgate to one of the strangest supernatural legends of modern times, the Highgate vampire. The panic began in 1969. when reports began to circulate of a tall, dark figure seen gliding among the graves. Witnesses described a man-like silhouette with blazing red eyes that gleamed in the darkness. Some said it wore a long black cloak. Others insisted it moved without sound, drifting rather than walking. Animals began turning up dead in the surrounding area, their bodies drained of blood. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by sensationalist newspapers, until the legend of the Highgate vampire consumed the imagination of London. But Highgate was already a breeding ground for ghostly tales long before the vampire hysteria. Locals had spoken of a woman in white drifting silently between the stones, her face pale and sorrowful. Others claimed to see a ghostly cyclist pedaling endlessly down Swain's Lane, the road skirting the cemetery walls. Shadows moved where none should be. The air inside the grounds was said to grow unnaturally cold, even on summer nights. Yet the arrival of the vampire figure took these whispers to a new level of dread. It was not merely passers-by who claimed to see the figure. Two teenage girls walking past the gates one evening reported a man staring out from between the bars. Tall, gaunt, his face ghastly pale, his eyes burning with an unholy light. They fled in terror. A businessman driving home late at night swore a shape glided across the road in front of his car, vanishing into the cemetery wall. A group of school children dared each other to enter after sunset. They returned pale and shaken, muttering of a towering presence that loomed over them without making a sound. By the early 1970s, the story had spread so far that it captured the attention of self-proclaimed vampire hunters. Two men in particular, Sean Manchester and David Farrant, took center stage, each declaring the cemetery home to a genuine undead presence. Manchester, styling himself as a bishop of an obscure church, claimed he would track and destroy the vampire. Farrant, a member of the British Occult Society, insisted the figure was a dark spirit tied to ritual magic. Their rivalry exploded into the tabloids, turning Highgate into a circus of midnight hunts and sensational headlines. Yet behind the theatrics were accounts not so easily dismissed. Police patrolling the grounds reported disturbances they could not explain. Sounds of chanting in the darkness, strange marks carved into mausoleum doors, even coffins broken open as though disturbed from within. One officer, speaking years later, admitted he felt watched every time he stepped into the overgrown west side of the cemetery. He recalled a night when he froze upon seeing what he described as 2 points of light, like burning coals suspended in the trees. They blinked once and were gone. The panic reached its peak in March of 1970. Hundreds of thrill-seekers stormed the cemetery one night after rumors spread that a vampire hunt was underway. Crowds climbed over the gates with flashlights and crucifixes, scattering through the graves in a frenzy. Some swore they saw figures darting between tombs, though no proof was ever found. Others claimed to hear inhuman hissing echoing from the crypts. In the days that followed, desecrated graves were discovered, coffins pried open, bodies disturbed. The media dismissed it as hysteria. But to those who had looked into the shadows, the terror felt all too real. Even today, stories of Highgate's restless dead continue. Visitors report a sudden suffocating cold near certain tombs, as if all the air has been drawn away. Others find themselves unable to move for long moments, as though frozen by an unseen force. Some speak of footsteps following them through the tangled paths, quickening when they quicken, stopping when they stop, yet no one is there. The most chilling tales describe the same dark figure that sparked the panic decades ago. Tall, cloaked, eyes glowing faintly red, gliding silently between the crumbling graves. Witnesses insist it has not faded with time. One of the most unsettling accounts came from a young man in the 1990s, long after the media frenzy had passed. He had been exploring the cemetery with friends when he strayed into the west side alone. The air grew unnaturally still. He felt the prickling sensation of being watched and turned slowly toward a row of tombs. There, half hidden in shadow, stood a towering figure. Its face was deathly pale, its mouth twisted into a grimace, its eyes two burning points of crimson. For several moments, the man could not move, his body locked in place. The figure raised one hand slowly as if beckoning. Only when a friend called out did the paralysis break and he fled, swearing he felt the figure glide after him until he burst through the gates into the night. Skeptics argue the Highgate vampire was nothing more than hysteria fueled by media and folklore. But believers point to the sheer consistency of the reports, spread over decades, from children, police officers, caretakers, and ordinary Londoners with nothing to gain from lies. Whatever prowls among the ivy and crumbling tombs of Highgate, it does not behave like an ordinary ghost. It is not content to appear briefly and fade. It looms, it follows, it paralyzes. Its presence is oppressive, predatory. Something lingers in those shadows, and those who feel it know instinctively it is hungry. The cemetery itself amplifies the terror. Vast, overgrown, labyrinthine, it swallows sound. The twisting paths disorient even by daylight. By night, the darkness feels alive. Angels streaked with moss seem to weep in the moonlight. Crosses tilt drunkenly toward the earth, and mausoleum doors gape open like mouths waiting to swallow intruders. To wander there after dusk is to step into a nightmare landscape, where every crunch of gravel beneath your feet echoes too loudly, and every flicker of shadow could conceal something watching. Highgate's legend endures not because of what the newspapers wrote, nor because of rival hunters who sought fame, but because people still see it. Tourists still come away shaken, describing the same tall figure, the same red eyes. Paranormal investigators still report spikes of energy near the Circle of Lebanon tombs, where the oldest graves lie in decay. And locals still avoid Swain's Lane after dark, unwilling to risk a glimpse of what might be waiting. The Highgate vampire may never have been proven. No coffin was ever unearthed with a corpse that fit the legend. The desert remembers everything. Out here, where the land is bone dry and the wind cuts like a razor, the past doesn't settle quietly into the dust. It lingers, it echoes, and sometimes it walks. In Tombstone, Arizona, there is a patch of earth known as Boot Hill Cemetery, a place that has outlasted the lives of outlaws, gunfighters, drifters, and wanderers who met their end violently and without warning. They called it Boot Hill for a reason. Most men buried here died with their boots still on, cut down by bullets, by knives, or by their own reckless living. The wooden markers still tilt under the sun, etched with crude epitaphs. Murdered in the streets. Here lies Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a .44, no less, no more. A grim humor born of violence. And yet, what remains after sundown is no laughing matter. Those who wander among the graves at dusk speak of a weight, a pressure in the air, as if the desert itself is holding its breath. The town of Tombstone is proud of its history. Tourists flock during the day to see staged gunfights and hear tales of Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and the OK Corral. But once the sun sinks behind the Dragoon Mountains and the tourists leave, the showmanship dies with the light, and what remains is something raw, a cemetery where the restless never found peace. There are countless stories told of Boot Hill after dark. One comes from a night watchman, an older man named Frank, who patrolled the grounds in the late 1970s when Tombstone still had fewer lights and the desert nights felt endless. He said the silence was always the first thing to get under your skin. No cicadas, no owls, no wind, just stillness. And then, without warning, the sound of spurs jingling across the gravel paths. Frank followed the sound, his flashlight beam cutting through the rows of crooked markers, until he saw a shape at the far end of the cemetery. A man, tall, wearing a long duster coat and a wide-brimmed hat, standing with his back turned, looking down at one of the graves. Frank called out, thinking it was a trespasser, but the man didn't move. He approached slowly, the crunch of gravel loud in the silence, and just as he raised the light to the stranger's shoulder, the figure turned. There was nothing there. The shape dissolved into the night air, and the jingling spurs faded into silence. Some believe the apparition is a cowboy buried there in the 1880s, a man killed in a saloon brawl, stabbed and left to bleed on Allen Street. His grave marker is one of the oldest and most worn, the writing nearly gone. But locals swear that when the air is right, on nights when the desert wind dies, he returns, still searching for the man who ended his life. Other stories are darker. Visitors often report hearing gunshots echoing from nowhere, loud, sharp cracks that roll across the open cemetery, as though a shootout is taking place just beyond the graves. Tourists have fallen flat to the ground, believing something real was happening, only to look up and find the night unchanged. A pair of travelers once claimed to see a group of shadowy figures crouched behind the grave markers, guns drawn, whispering, waiting for a fight that never came. When headlights from a passing car swept the cemetery fence, the shadows vanished, leaving only dust swirling in the beam. The cemetery is also said to host the spirit of a woman, though no one knows her story. They call her the Weeping Lady of Boot Hill. Some say she lost her husband in one of the countless gunfights. Others claim she was murdered herself, left in an unmarked grave. Witnesses describe a figure in a pale dress drifting between the rows, her hair long, her face obscured. Once, in the late 1990s, a couple driving past the cemetery pulled over after seeing a woman standing near the gate. Thinking she was lost or in trouble, they called out, but she did not answer. When they approached, she lifted her head, and her face was little more than shadow. Before they could reach her, she faded, the dress dissolving into the desert night like mist. The couple drove away, shaken, certain that they had encountered something not of this world. Some legends cling tightly to the old gunfighters themselves. Wyatt Earp's brothers, Virgil and Morgan, are buried elsewhere, but the men they shot down in the infamous OK Corral gunfight rest here in Boot Hill. Ike Clanton, Billy Clanton, and the McClory brothers. Tour guides during the day will point to their markers, retelling the tale of October 26, 1881, when gunfire erupted on Fremont Street and 30 seconds of violence left 3 men dead. But at night, those markers are said to draw energy. A paranormal team once filmed there after hours, reporting strange electromagnetic spikes and the sound of men's voices caught on tape. Low, angry, cursing in ways too distinct to be dismissed as the wind. One recording, played back later, held a chilling whisper, "We ain't done." The desert itself seems to conspire with the spirits. Boot Hill is surrounded by dry brush, and when the wind picks up, it whips the dead grass against the markers, creating a sound like footsteps. The old wooden fences creak and the gravel paths crunch as though someone is walking beside you. A historian who often lectured about Tombstone once swore he saw lantern light bobbing among the graves late at night. He thought it was vandals or drunk teenagers, but as he drew closer, he realized the lanterns were too steady, too deliberate, moving in a line as though carried by men marching. When he reached the edge of the cemetery, the lights winked out all at once, leaving him in absolute blackness. He refused to return after dark again. Perhaps the most unnerving tale comes from a group of reenactors, men who performed the staged gunfights for tourists during the day. In 2005, a handful of them decided to test the stories, dressing in their period gear and sneaking into Boot Hill after closing. They thought it would be fun, maybe even a good promotional gimmick to share later. They brought cameras and set up a mock shootout among the markers. But as they began their performance, a sound answered them. Real gunfire, close, loud, sharp. The men froze, the laughter caught in their throats. In the silence that followed, they heard boots running behind them, circling, and the low growl of men's voices arguing. One of them swore a shadow shoved him to the ground, though no one stood nearby. When they scrambled out of the cemetery, pale and shaken, they realized none of it had been caught on tape. The cameras had shut off the moment the first shot rang out. Even now, the stories persist. Tourists taking photos have found strange orbs and figures in the background. Sometimes a cowboy leaning on a grave marker, sometimes a woman in white drifting in the distance. Locals say you should never stay past sundown, and if you do, never answer when someone calls your name from the dark. Because in Boot Hill, the past isn't gone. The men who died with their boots on still walk, still fight, still haunt the desert night. In Dublin, there is a cemetery that stretches farther than the eye can follow. A vast sea of stone crosses, angels with weathered wings, and crypts carved into the earth like gaping mouths. Glasnevin Cemetery is no ordinary graveyard. Since the early 1800s, it has swallowed the dead of Ireland's turbulent history, rebels, poets, paupers, and the forgotten. Its walls hold over 1 million souls, and yet the silence there is never empty. Some say it listens, some say it breathes, and others believe that in the damp hours of night, when fog curls low and the lamps along Finglas Road flicker against the black sky, the dead themselves walk. Glasnevin was founded in 1832, at a time when burial grounds for Catholics were scarce. Its gates were built wide, its grounds sprawling to house generations. But Ireland in the 19th century was a restless place. Disease, famine, rebellion. The cemetery grew thick with bodies. Grave markers crowded so close together that the living had to weave carefully through the narrow paths to find the one they sought. And in those early years, another problem haunted the grounds: body snatchers. The dead were not left to rest. Anatomy schools paid well for fresh corpses, and gangs crept into cemeteries at night with shovels, hooks, and sacks. Glasnevin was no exception. To combat this grim trade, watchtowers were built along the walls. Guards patrolled with lanterns, rifles slung at their sides, ears straining for the scrape of a shovel in the dark. Stories spread that some grave robbers who were caught never left the grounds alive. Whether true or not, what followed were whispers, accounts from those same guards of shadows that moved without bodies, of voices calling out from freshly dug earth, of phantom hands scratching from beneath the soil. The cemetery became a place where the boundary between the dead and the living was worn dangerously thin. And through the decades, one figure returned again and again in hushed retellings: the Crying Woman of Glasnevin. She is said to wander the rows of children's graves, her sobs cutting through the night like glass, her shape cloaked in black. Some claim she wears the garb of a widow from the famine years, her veil soaked with endless tears. Others say she appears near more recent burials, as though her grief is unbound by time. A voice of mourning that belongs to every loss, and to none. One of the earliest accounts comes from a night watchman in the 1880s. His testimony, written in shaky hand, was discovered years later in parish records. He claimed he was stationed at the South Tower when he heard the sound of weeping drifting through the fog. At first, he thought it was a mourner who had lost her way, lingering too long after the gates closed. He followed the sound, lantern swinging, until he reached a cluster of small rounded stones, graves of children lost to cholera. There he saw her, a figure hunched over, her shoulders heaving with sobs, the black folds of her dress pressed against the stones. When he called out, the woman rose slowly and turned. He swore her face was pale as moonlight, her eyes dark and empty. The lantern flickered, the air froze, and she was gone. The watchman never returned for another shift, but she has not been confined to the past. In the 1970s, a family came to Glasnevin to lay flowers at a grandfather's grave. As dusk settled, they lingered too long, and when they made their way back to the gates, they heard crying, soft at first, then louder, raw with grief. The mother of the family stopped, gripped by unease, and scanned the rows. She saw a woman standing among the graves, her form blurred in the growing fog. Believing she needed help, the mother called out, but the woman did not move. The children grew frightened, tugging at their mother's arm. And then, as they turned away, the crying stopped, cut short as if a switch had been pulled. When they looked back, the figure had vanished. The family left in silence, carrying with them a memory they refused to discuss until years later. Paranormal investigators have since combed the grounds, capturing strange phenomena. In one instance, an investigator set up a recorder near the older section of children's burials. Hours later, when he played back the audio, a low moaning filled the speakers, rising into the unmistakable sound of a woman sobbing. No one had been there. Another team captured photographs in which pale streaks of light coiled like ribbons around the graves, forming shapes that looked almost like outstretched arms. Skeptics dismiss these as tricks of light, but the heaviness that falls upon those who stand in that section is difficult to explain away, and Glasnevin's hauntings are not limited to the Crying Woman. Gravediggers, working late, have reported footsteps, pacing the pathways when no one else was present. A historian cataloging old stones after dark claimed he saw a man in a top hat pass by, his figure crisp and clear, yet he cast no shadow, and his steps made no sound. Tourists walking the perimeter wall have described hearing metallic clinks, as though shovels struck stone, even though the days of body snatchers ended long ago. Sometimes it is the simplest details that unsettle most. A sudden drop in temperature, the smell of earth too strong, too fresh, as though a grave had just been dug nearby. One story, whispered by locals, tells of a priest who locked the gates late one winter's night, only to hear frantic knocking from inside moments later. Thinking someone had been left behind, he unlocked the gate and swung it open, lantern held high. But the path was empty. The knocking had stopped. Yet as he stood listening, the sound rose again, this time from deep within the grounds, echoing faintly against the crypts. The priest locked the gates and walked away, never turning back, his prayers spilling from trembling lips, and always, the crying woman returns. Some believe she is not one soul but many, that the grief of centuries has coalesced into one shape, one endless sobbing voice that cannot be silenced. Those who have heard her say it is not like hearing an ordinary. In the heart of Prague, beyond the winding alleys of the old town, there lies a cemetery unlike any other. It is a place where the dead are not buried side by side, but on top of one another, layer upon layer, century after century. The old Jewish cemetery, founded in the 1400s, became the final resting place for a community that was given little land and no room to grow. So the graves were stacked, up to 12 deep, the earth rising higher with each generation until the headstones jutted at crooked angles, leaning like teeth in a broken jaw. Over 12,000 stones remain, but beneath them lie countless more bodies, pressed together under the same soil, their names lost to time. By day, the cemetery is a marvel of history. The stones tilt and crowd each other, Hebrew inscriptions worn by rain, trees rising twisted from the ground as if nourished by centuries of unspoken prayers. Tourists walk its narrow paths, whispering as though afraid to disturb the silence. But by night, when the gates are locked and the alleys fall still, the old Jewish cemetery becomes something else. The weight of the centuries hangs heavy, and the air seems charged, thick with memory, with grief, and with something darker. Many believe that so many restless dead layered upon each other cannot remain quiet, and that in the hours before dawn, they stir. One of the most enduring legends tied to this ground is that of Rabbi Judah Lo ben Bezalel, known simply as the Maharal of Prague. In the late 1500s, it was said he created the golem, a being of clay, brought to life through sacred rituals, to protect the Jewish community from persecution. When the creature grew uncontrollable, it was laid to rest, hidden away. Some whisper that the golem's body still lies somewhere within the old new synagogue. Others believe it was buried deep within this cemetery, entombed among the thousands. At night, when footsteps echo where no one should walk, some say it is not just the spirits of the dead, but something heavier, something bound by clay and silence, that moves. Accounts of strange encounters within the cemetery span centuries. In the 19th century, a scholar working late on translations described hearing voices rising like a chant from the center of the grounds. At first, he thought it was a prayer service, though it was long after midnight and the gates had been shut tight. He climbed to the wall to peer inside. What he saw chilled him, a cluster of faint, translucent figures, robes pale in the moonlight, swaying as though in unison. Their lips moved, but their faces were indistinct, as though blurred by water. He blinked and they were gone. Yet the sound of chanting followed him through the streets as he fled, trailing him all the way to his lodgings. Modern visitors have not been spared. In 1993, a tourist from Germany described wandering too long in the old quarter, finding herself pressed against the cemetery's gates as night fell. She leaned close to the iron bars, peering between them, when she heard weeping, soft, almost delicate, drifting from the stones inside. It grew louder, spreading until it seemed to circle her. She backed away, but the crying pursued her down the alley, echoing against the walls. When she turned, she saw a figure in black standing just inside the gate, face hidden beneath a shawl. The figure lifted a hand, pointing directly at her. Terrified, she ran, but for weeks after returning home, she swore she heard faint sobs whenever she tried to sleep. Guards who patrol the grounds tell their own stories. One, interviewed anonymously in the early 2000s, said he had grown used to the creaks and groans of the cemetery at night. The way trees shifted, the stones seemed to whisper when the wind cut through. But one night, as he circled the outer wall, he heard distinct footsteps on gravel, pacing him step for step on the other side. He froze, listening. The steps stopped. He moved again, and so did they. Desperate to catch the trespasser, he shone his torch through the bars, sweeping the beam across the crooked rows of stones. There was no one. The light revealed only tilted slabs and shadow, yet the footsteps continued, circling until they stopped abruptly in front of a centuries-old grave marked with the name Lo. He never patrolled alone again. Some say shadows move freely in the old Jewish cemetery, slipping from stone to stone, standing where no one stands. A historian cataloging the site once snapped a series of photographs at dusk. When developed, the images showed more than he expected. In one, a cluster of stones leaned together like mourners at prayer, But behind them stood a figure, tall, cloaked, featureless. He was certain no one else had been there. He locked the prints away, and when he died, his family refused to release them. Too unsettling, they said. There are those who claim to have seen the dead rise here, not in grotesque form, but as pale, translucent shapes that drift silently among the rows. One student recalled sneaking in with friends during the 1970s, climbing the wall after dark. They dared each other to walk between the stones without flinching. As they laughed, one of them pointed to a figure in the distance, a man, bent, moving slowly between the graves. They thought it was another trespasser, until the man raised his head and his face seemed hollow, empty, a blur where features should be. The laughter died. The students fled, but one swore he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder as he climbed the wall. When he looked back, no one was there. Perhaps the most chilling tale comes from a Czech folklorist who spent nights documenting legends in the early 20th century. He wrote that on certain nights the cemetery grows unnaturally quiet, even the wind dying to nothing. In that silence a sound rises, not weeping, not chanting, but scratching. Faint at first, then louder, like nails clawing against wood. It comes from beneath the earth, from the layers of coffins stacked one upon another. The folklorist said he heard it himself, standing frozen as the sound grew until it seemed dozens of hands were clawing from below, desperate to break free. He left before the noise reached its peak, but he swore it followed him, echoing in his ears for the rest of his life. Today, the old Jewish cemetery is preserved as a historical site. By day it is filled with visitors, their footsteps echoing along the narrow paths, their voices hushed in reverence. But the legends persist. Tourists still report capturing strange mists in photographs, or hearing whispers in languages they cannot understand. Guides warn visitors not to linger at dusk, and those who work nearby cross themselves when they pass the gates after dark. Too many stories, too much weight in the earth, for here the dead do not lie in orderly rows. They are stacked, pressed together, restless, generations layered over one another, voices entwined, grief upon grief. It is said that memory itself saturates this ground, that sorrow seeps into the stones and rises again with the mist. And in the still hours of night, when the city sleeps and the alleys are empty, the old Jewish cemetery breathes. The dead walk their narrow paths, the shadows lengthen, and if you press too close to the gates, you may hear them. A prayer, a sob, a scratch rising from beneath the earth. And when you step away, when you retreat into the safety of light and distance, the feeling may follow you,